My name is Melissa Weekly. This is my MIT 822 Module 5 video on cognitive load in hypermedia. So to sum up what I learned from the article very briefly on cognitive load theory, we can only learn so much at one time. In order for us to process things into our working memory, we need to be able to focus our attention on one thing in order to process it and rehearse it. So a lot of the times our valuable information's missed merely because there's just so much going on. Our attention is all over the place. We're not able to focus on we're truly needing to learn. So when we're creating things, if these visuals don't serve a purpose to what we're trying to learn, they're just merely a distraction. This made me think to a lesson that I just taught with my students about the connection of wavelength and frequency involving the electromagnetic spectrum. When I was searching visuals and I saw this online as a teacher, I got very excited because it had all the connections that I wanted. However, I knew I couldn't show this to my students because of the overload that it produces. It throws in numbers, it throws in colors, pictures. Where it is aesthetically pleasing and it does have those visuals, it would completely overload them and they would not get from it what I wanted them to. So I found this visual where it is not as colorful, not as aesthetically pleasing, there's no pictures. However, they're able to get from this exactly what I want them to get. They're able to visually see that gamma rays have that shorter wavelength, that radio waves have that longer wavelength. The text is very brief and concise, but it provides exactly what I want them to know. That shorter wavelength has higher frequency. Longer wavelength has lower frequency. They're able to see this and make a quick connection rather than look at this and while it's the same thing, just be completely overwhelmed. So when we're creating things, we need to think, does it add value to what they're learning? Things like different fonts, these cause clutter too. They're focusing on the cute fonts rather than the text that they're actually reading. Do the images add to what's being taught, or are they just used to fill space? I'm very guilty of this when I create things. I see a blank space, I add an image. But then I realize the image, while it has to do with what we're talking about, it's just merely a distraction. It has nothing to do with what I truly want them to learn. And things like, are captions or labels needed? I often use visuals to reinforce what I've taught, so then there's no reason to add captions or labels. Those take away from what I'm actually trying to get students to make a connection for themselves. So talking about split attention. I found this visual online, which I liked a lot because this made me think of back out of something like a textbook when I was in elementary school and I was terrible at math. If I were to read a problem and look at this example 1, I would be able to quickly see the shape, see the degrees, and be able to answer the question. If I were to look at example 2, I would read the question, I would identify the shape, I'd have to identify the letters, match the letters down to the text to the degrees, go back and forth to be able to visualize what degree went where, and then by that point I'd completely forgotten what the question was asking of me. And I think this causes a lot of frustration in our students, especially in hypermedia, when their attention's all over the place. If they're required to click on things, it just becomes more of a distraction and more frustrating than it has anything to do with learning at that point. So some tips when we are creating hypermedia. What is the outcome you're trying to achieve? If what you are adding doesn't add any value to your specific outcome, get rid of it. There's no purpose for it. Is it possible to break up what you're teaching into smaller parts? So for example, back to my visual, if I were to show them this is the exact opposite of breaking something into smaller parts. If I wanted to just focus on wavelength and frequency, I needed to take everything else out. Also including narration rather than text boxes while pointing or somehow diverting attention to visuals. When we're, like I guess what I'm doing right now, talking and providing narration to something that we already have on screen in text, that takes students' focus away. When we can point to a visual and talk about it, that takes their focus to our voice and the visual. If there's a text box also included, then that takes away their attention from our voice or the text box. They need to be able to focus on one or the other. There's no reason for both. And finally, what's organized to us isn't always organized to our students. Think about your desk, think about your grade book. While we look at it and it makes complete sense, it doesn't always to anyone else. This made me think back to college and undergrad when we would get lectures and notes. I would spend more of my time focusing on why the teacher presented the notes that way, or what the connection was, or how the reason they did that, rather than the content that I was truly supposed to be learning. And I think we do that to our students often too. Based on our own prior knowledge, we expect them to know those connections when really they're spending more time making them, and that's not the outcome that we want them to achieve.